Hello, how are you? Thank you for returning and thank you for watching. I am going to give you today Theology number 5. To give a little background on our recent videos, I want to cover some of the things that I want to make clear. I am not condemning anyone. I'm not trying to say anything's been wrong. What I'm trying to do is provide these videos so that people will know that my opinion of what I've concluded is probably a real part of history, and therefore should be examined to see if it would do any good by using what already has happened in the past. I'm trying to make sure that what I do is as close to reality as actually happened in the past, that we can learn from that so we can move forward. Today I'm going to be talking about Moses, and it will be a different attitude about Moses than anything you've ever heard before. When I say Moses, we're going to start actually with something that happened in 1922. What happened then was, as archaeology was just getting started, someone discovered the grave of Tutankhamun, known as King Tut. And the reason that they were aware of that is just 100 years ago, in 1800, someone found a Rosetta Stone that taught them how to read the hieroglyphs in Egyptian. And in addition to that, how to read cuneiform, and it was all written also in a third language, which is Greek, which the gentleman that found it knew how to read. So now he knew how to translate the information that had been lost to humanity. So since 1922, we've learned a lot of things that we didn't know before. And as our experience with King Tut has moved forward, we've learned also about Akhenaten. Akhenaten was a pharaoh in Egypt, but he was a pharaoh that should not be. He was the number 2 son. I believe that some of the things that Moses wrote about did not seem logical to me, but then he had a particular purpose in mind when he wrote what he wrote. Moses feels that he was called by God to come and create a society of people that were herdsmen. And in the first chapter of Moses, at the end of the chapter, you can see exactly why he had that attitude. And that was, it ends with they were put in Goshen because no self-respecting Egyptian would have anything to do with them. They consider that it was not a very prestigious thing to do in order to be a herdsman. They thought that being a herdsman was something that was looked down upon, and they didn't want anything to do with it. Now, as we move forward, Moses told the Adam and Eve story. He specifically did that for a reason, and one of the reasons was to turn the tide around so that the herdsmen were the good people. So when he talked about the Cain and Abel, it was Cain that was the bad guy, which was the farmer, and Abel, which was the good guy, that was the herdsman. But we know that Moses was not perfect, and he made some mistakes. And one of the mistakes he made was he thought that his theology, which he learned from being appointed to be a priest in one of the temples that the Egyptians worshiped when he was growing up there in the royal family. Moses was trained with all of the knowledge that they knew and that they were teaching the new pharaohs, and the education that they all got. Unfortunately, Moses had to leave. I believe the reason he had to leave was not fully explained in the writing of the Torah. What Moses said is he killed an Egyptian guard and therefore had to flee. But what we know is that the legal system there was a slave system. The people in the royal family were better than other people. So when they talk about a guard, he would need to be punished for it because he should have no right to kill a guard, and he would probably be sent to bed without anything to eat, and maybe not even eat for a couple of days until he learned his lesson that he was not to kill the guards, because the guards were there to help and protect the royal family. But in fact, what may have really happened is what we know from history and other writing, is that the number one son, which was in line to be the pharaoh when his father died, had turned 18, and I think a little bit of civil rivalry occurred, and the three of them, the older, the younger, and Moses, all three of them got in a little squabble about what should be done. As I explained earlier, the male attitude that has not been confined or restricted in some degree has the attitude that anything that doesn't agree with you, you kill it. And he was probably expressing that when he became Pharaoh, Moses and his younger brother were nothing and could be exterminated at his will. As the fight escalated, the older brother, probably some by accident, but he got killed. And when the father found out that his son was dead, there was something at the scene that led him think that a priest might be involved. Now, what the father concluded is the priest was involved because the older son was a half-breed. When he became Pharaoh, they gave him an official wife, but his official wife was only 3 years old. So as he was now married, being the Pharaoh of Egypt, he had the opportunity to marry as many women as he wanted. So he married a woman that he loved, which was a commoner, and she happened to be a Hebrew. So her children were basically half-breeds. And being a half-breed, the father assumed that the priest killed him because the priest did not want a half-breed to be Pharaoh. So they immediately sent his wife and his younger son to Goshen. Now there's where the terms come together. That is where the Hebrews were put when they came down after Joseph brought his family into Egypt, according to the story of Moses. And that was where, in fact, we know that the younger son went. Now, there was what I'd refer to as a social climber that also went to Goshen to seek out the younger son and to be friends with him. And her name was Nefertiti. Nefertiti endured herself to the younger son, and they got married. When they got married, Nefertiti was from the royal family. Now their children would be more than half-breeds. They'd be 3/4 royal Egyptian kids. So the father made his son, Akhenaten, a co-ruler with him during the last few years he was alive. So the big winner from the accident that Moses had with the older son, the younger son that was there at the time probably was the big winner from the incident and the accident that happened to his older brother. Now, as time went on, Moses did leave. He had to flee, and not necessarily because he killed a guard, but notwithstanding that he was a nephew of the royal family, if he killed the next pharaoh, he is going to die. So it was not a hard call for Moses to know that he had to leave town. So Moses actually left town. He went out into the wilderness and he became a shepherd. After many years, he realized that some of the people in Egypt weren't doing well, and he went back to bring the people out of Egypt. Now, probably the only tribe that was actually there were the Levites. But when the Levites came out, Moses created the story for all of them so that all of the herdsmen basically were convinced that they were part of Jacob's family and would join this new country that Moses was trying to create. As Moses was able to gather many, many people from around the different places where they were seeing their herds, he took them with him to what he called the Promised Land. He created the story about Abraham all the way down through Joseph so that the people would all feel like they were all part of the family and therefore deserved to have what was promised to them by God to their father Abraham. So as Moses continued to escalate this story by taking it to Mount Sinai, going up and getting the 10 Commandments for them to understand. Now the 10 Commandments, we have to remember, was at a time before Hebrew writing was perfected. At the time Moses was trained, he was trained to know what all the hieroglyphs in Egypt was about. So when he broke the original tablets that supposedly were drafted by God, Moses had to chip out the language for the 10 Commandments by himself in the new stones that were put into the Ark of the Covenant. And those would have had to be in Egyptian hieroglyphs because Moses did not know any other writing at that time. They were probably later translated in about any place from 300 to 500 years later as writing developed and the Hebrews or the Israelis developed their own language and their own writing. Then as the scribes were starting to write down the story from years gone by, they had the word of mouth and any writings that were there, they were probably also trained to read the hieroglyphs. But we know that we had more than one writer in the first 5 books of the Torah, and so many people came in later on to write down what was passed down from year after year through maybe 200 to 300 years before it got put in writing. But once it was put in writing, then we had the beginning of the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Torah and the other writings that they included that became part of the Christians' Old Testament. And since I am a Christian, I will refer to all of those Jewish writings now as part of the Old Testament. I am understanding that basically with that the numbering is slightly different and the way it's worded, but pretty much the New Testament is the only books that were added to the Bible. There were 39 books in the Bible of the Christians for the Old Testament, and they pretty much are word for word what all of the writings in the Torah are for the Hebrew people and for the Jewish people and for the Israeli people. Now, the 27 books of the New Testament are the ones that identify the Christians as being different from the Jewish people, and we refer to them as Jewish people because that's where they built the temple in Jerusalem. So when the temple was destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, this all happened in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem considers themselves basically the head family of the rest of the family of the Israeli people. The time that this is going on, we have back in Egypt that Akhenaten has now become the Pharaoh of Egypt. His father has passed away. He was co-ruler with his Pharaoh father for a few years, and when the father died, he was already ingrained in the position. He lasted for around 10 years and seemed to disappear. Some people identify Akhenaten and Moses as the same people, but the timing's not quite right. By the time Akhenaten took over and started ruling, Moses had already left the country and had not had an opportunity to come back yet. During the time that Akhenaten was ruler, His wife was very powerful as well. They had several daughters together. And one day Akhenaten disappeared. No one knows really what happened to him, but when Nefertiti realized he wasn't around, she took over as pharaoh. And she ruled for a couple of years before basically her 8-year-old son was declared to be the new pharaoh of Egypt. Now, that didn't happen without some unusual dealings occurring. What actually happened was that the general that happened to be with Akhenaten or around where he was when he disappeared was also present with Nefertiti, and evidently through an altercation, the general killed Nefertiti. When she did that, the advisor to her son, who was born an invalid and pretty much was an invalid his whole life, had an advisor which was her uncle. Now, her uncle probably didn't sanction or approve her being killed, but he did take advantage of it by declaring her son, Tutankhamun, as the new ruler of Egypt. And of course, Tutankhamun at that time was only 8 years old. No 8-year-old child knows anything about what went on. So the one that was actually calling the shots was the uncle. And his name happened to be I. And the reason we know that is, unfortunately, Tutankhamun only lasted about 10 years, and he died from his ailments that he was born with. Well, when Tutankhamun died without any heirs, I had no choice but to declare himself as Pharaoh of Egypt. Now, I was in the royal family, but not in the royal line to ever be a pharaoh. So it was an unusual thing that Egypt had to deal with. And the thing that made it even more unusual is when I died, the general declared himself pharaoh. By the time the general either died or Egypt decided to get rid of him, they brought in the Ramses. Now, this is the first time that Ramses is mentioned as any name with the pharaohs. And when Moses tells his stories, everything happened with the Ramses. So when the Ramses took charge, clearly the story that Moses made up, he made up for his convenience as soon as all of the people that knew Moses and what he might have done had already come and gone. So the general probably wasn't privy to the things that went on in the royal family, but I probably knew everything pretty much that had happened. So at the time that Ramses took over, and Moses writes in his story that it was the city of Ramses that the Hebrews were being made slaves for, is probably what we think it would be, a story. And it was the story to help explain why they got out into the wilderness and why the things happened the way they did. Now, it's not just an accident that they wandered for a while in the wilderness, because by the time they started to moving into Canaan, all of the people that had joined the Hebrews or the tribe of Israel at that time were a collection of herdsmen from any place that they happened to pick them up. As they moved around the hills or moved around the desert and the places where there were grass, they would pick up more and more herdsmen to join the group as the Israeli people. Now, one of the reasons for the story being told the way they did, with one father and 4 wives, that would explain why the different groups did not necessarily resemble each other. So the true Israeli nation was pretty much the same kind of nation that America ended up being. People from different countries came in together and they were all Americans. That was exactly what happened with Moses. Now, by the time all of the original people had died off, Moses then made a move into Canaan. The problem that Moses had at that time was that during the time they were wandering and gathering their people together, the Ramses had to deal with the boat people. And part of those boat people were what was left over from the Philistines. Some of the Philistines fought with the Egyptians to defeat the boat people because the Philistines had dealt with Egypt for 4,000 to 8,000 years in the past. So that is why the Egyptians gave the Philistines the land on the outskirts that they owned. And the furthest away that they owned was up in the land that they had had their first battle with the Hittites over. And that was the time that the area basically records the first battle that ever happened between two nations. Now, the battle ended up being a draw. The Egyptians agreed not to go north of the river, and the Hittites agreed to not go south of the river. So just south of the river is where the cities were that the Egyptians placed the Philistines. So by the time the Hebrews had moved into the hill country to do their grazing, the Philistines had already been established a few years before down on the coastland. Now, at that time, there is Joshua that comes into the picture, but we will probably talk about that at another time because that's an interesting time of history as well. At this time, I'm going to terminate the video. I think that we are probably at the maximum time. And I want to thank everyone for watching it. And if you enjoyed it, I would appreciate if you would subscribe. I hope that you're willing to come back and listen to more of what I have to say. I am going to be doing the next couple of videos on the part of the system that I refer to as passion. And the passion system I refer to comes in three parts. It has to do with the thinking, it has to do with the commerce, and it has to do with the government. That's three different sections, three different issues, and they'll be discussed during the time discussing government issues. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you subscribe and come back in the future. And goodbye for now.